Hello, welcome to this video lecture, which is on the marketing environment. Now, previously, we had discussed building a brand value by controlling what's known as the marketing mix, also known as the 4 Ps: product, price, promotion, and distribution or place. We use the word place so we can call it the 4 Ps. And these are the things that we control, the kind of the control levers. On a lot of our decisions, almost all of our decisions will fall within the marketing mix. However, the marketing mix is not all of what we have to deal with. We have to survive and market within certain environments. The first layer of that environment is the micro environment. And these are things which we don't control, but have some influence over, such as the company, specifically the type of company it is, what its culture is, what its core mission is. Certainly our suppliers, various publics, which we'll talk about, any market intermediaries such as distributors or promotional agencies, our customers, and even our competitors. Beyond that, we have something called the macro environment. Now, the macro environment consists of various macro environmental forces, which we have no control over it. I would compare it to, like if you're a sailor, it would be the wind. The wind can help you or the wind can hurt you, but you have no control over it. You just have to navigate it. You have to take advantage of it when it's moving in your direction and figure out how to deal with it when it's not moving in your direction, moving against you. And that's just the nature of this. And that includes things like cultural forces, technological forces, nature, legal and political forces, the economy, as well as demographics. The microenvironment, which I just mentioned a moment ago, these are things, like I said, the company, what's their mission, what's their objectives, what strategies are they undertaking, capabilities and expertise, and how that's expressed through its structure. Not every product works for every company. Every companies have certain core competencies, and does the product that you want to market fit within its overall strategic plan, its strategic structure? So that will have an effect. Suppliers certainly affect us, certainly in terms of shortages. As of this lecture is being recorded in 2022, when there are a lot of supply chain issues going on. Certain things are not available as they once were. Hopefully they will be again, but we'll see. Certainly strikes can cause problems with suppliers. If you need a certain component or ingredient for your product and there's a strike going on at the factory that manufactures it, you've got a problem. Also, there are quality issues that may come into play. I remember, for instance, Firestone was a supplier of tires to the Ford Motor Company, specifically for their Ford Explorer line. And there were apparently some quality problems, and that created huge difficulties for Ford. Obviously, it created huge difficulties for Firestone, and Ford had to change its supplier after decades of working with that company. Also, market intermediaries, as I mentioned, these are people who resell your products, they're essentially your customers who then will sell to the consumer. Any sort of distributor, and promotional firms such as advertising agencies, PR agencies, that sort of thing. In addition, obviously, customers, and there are very many types of customers. There's the consumer, and again, the consumer is somebody who uses the product, doesn't simply buy it, but they actually use it. Sometimes some customers will buy a product to either give or sell to someone else. There are business customers. There's the consumer markets, and for people who will consume, and then there are business markets for people who will do various other things with it, and we'll talk about that in a future lecture. But they may consume it themselves, they may resell it, they may integrate it into their product. Um, and some of those are resellers, others not. There are a lot of products that are sold primarily to the government. Military hardware, for instance, is essentially, if you're making military hardware, your customers are a government. And also, obviously, they're international markets, so all of these can be duplicated or replicated across the world. So there are all sorts of customers, and are those customers likely to buy your product? Are there certain reasons they might not? So we'll have to deal with that, and of course, we try to influence those customers. Competitors, we have direct competitors like Coke and Pepsi. They are direct competitors. Other competitors are indirect, where they are not, they don't necessarily look alike, but they certainly can come into the customer's consideration set when they're considering buying a product. Also, often many competitors have cooperative relationships. For instance, airlines. Yes, they compete with one another, but sometimes they can cooperate. For instance, let's say you've decided to go on a European vacation, and you want to visit, two cities in Europe, let's say London and Prague. So you go to airline A. Airline A says, "Oh yes, we can sell you a ticket to London. Oh, and a ticket from Prague back to your point of origin. Oh, but they don't actually have flights between London and Prague." What do? Well, they could say, "Well, sorry, that's it." Well, then they lose the sales of the other flights, because if they can't solve that problem, what they often do is they will sell you flights from other airlines. There'll be another airline, we'll call it Airline B, who flies from London to Prague, and so that will enable them to sell you the other two flights, and they will cooperate with that other airline to give you the third connecting flight. And you'll find in many industries there are competitors who, yes, they compete, but sometimes they also cooperate. So competitors are not necessarily enemies. They're not they're not trying to destroy each other. People are just trying to make do as well as they can, and sometimes that means cooperation. Also, there are various publics, and there's obviously the general public. Sometimes there are citizen action groups, people who are for or against certain products. Like, there are people who may be against animal cruelty. Maybe there are vegan groups. Maybe there are people who are for or against certain government actions, and they may protest you, or they may support you. You have to look at that. For publicly traded companies, there are financial publics. If your company's stock is traded on a stock exchange, then you have a financial public, who could be anyone. The media, certainly, the news media may have good things or bad things to say about your product, so you want to pay attention to that, as well as the government. Governments impose regulations and other laws and taxes and things like that, and we'll talk more about that coming up. And also employees. People often forget how important employees are, not simply to do their job, but also what their attitudes are towards the company. If you have a company where the employees are unhappy, they might actually be detrimental to the overall health of the company, in that they might say bad things about the company. In fact, I had this happen. I just happened to have 3 students in one class. It was a night class, and so these were very much adult students. They were slightly older, and they worked for a telecommunications company, and they told me I should use a competitor. Their competitor was better than that, and that was kind of shocking. Usually people are in favor of their own company, and most companies, I think most companies I've worked for, I've really liked. I felt proud to work for those companies, um, whether they were corporations or schools or whatever. Um, if I wasn't happy, I would probably move on. But if you have, and there have been cases where um, employees actually intentionally or unintentionally undermine their own company simply because they're dissatisfied. There was a certain supermarket chain, I won't name them, but they were in very bad shape, and the management decided to bring in they wanted us to have an advertising campaign, and as part of the due diligence and just getting finding out about the client, and the ad agency visited some of these stores and saw that things were in bad shape. It wasn't simply that they didn't have good promotion. The employees didn't care about what was going on in the store. They saw lots of boxes, laying about, the unpacked or half unpacked boxes and in the aisles, and so they came back to the client and they said, before we do an external campaign, we need to do an internal campaign. We need to build up the employees' pride in the company, their desire to make the place look nice, things like that. There was a real morale problem, and that morale problem was very much on display to any customers. So actually bringing more customers in would not have helped, because people go, oh, this is a horrible place. Let me go to another store. So these are all these micro environmental forces or environments are not, unlike the macro environments, they're not under our control, but we can still have an influence over them, and they need to be addressed. Now onto the macro environmental forces. These are, again, forces which we have no control over, none whatsoever. But they very much affect our business and our ability to market products. Certainly the economy is a major factor there. For instance, in general, the demand for most products increases as the economy improves. Generally, as GDP, gross domestic product, as productivity goes up, as people feel confident in the economy, they tend to buy more. They feel comfortable about the future. They're willing to start spending money. And of course, and the same thing happens in reverse. If an economy starts to go down, GDP goes down, people get nervous about their employment situation. Even if they still have a job, they start to cut back on certain purchases. But for some products, actually, the demand increases when the economy declines. And this seems counterintuitive, but if you think about it, there are certain products that people tend to buy more of when things are bad. First category would be things like low-cost substitutes. Instead of buying the steak, I'll buy the hamburger, or instead of buying the hamburger, I'll buy the hot dog, or something like that. We cut back. In fact, during the 2007 to 2009 recession, McDonald's did very well, and actually it was on their high-end items too. Mainly because instead of people going out for lunch at places like TGI Fridays, they went to McDonald's, but they had the high-end stuff. Their entire menu did well, but so low-cost substitutes do well as the economy declines. Other products that do well are things associated with depression. For instance, you've lost your job. What happens? People start to drink more. Maybe they smoke more. Maybe they take drugs, both prescription and unprescribed drugs. People self-medicate. So it does have an effect. Another category of product that is actually connected to education. When we see the economy in decline, the demand for two-year schools or trade school training increase. Not so with four-year schools, however. And I remember during the Great Recession, around 2009, 2007 to 2009, I worked for both a university and a community college, and the enrollment at the university actually went down, but the community college I was working at went up from about 9,000 students to 13,000 students. This is in less than a year. Mainly because people realize that they're going to be in a very competitive environment and they need to improve themselves. They need to improve their product, which was their labor. They need to improve their resume, and they need to do it fairly quickly. And a two-year school can do that. People also go for certifications and other types of training, whereas four-year schools are more of a long-term investment in the future as opposed to a quick fix. And so that's sort of the dichotomy between the four-year schools and the two-year schools. I'm sorry, before going, so other things that affect, obviously the unemployment rate, inflation. In 2022, we're seeing a lot of inflation, which we haven't seen in many decades. So these are also factors that will fall into not simply employment rates, but also what is the wage levels. These all have an effect on because if wage levels go up, that might trigger inflation. It's all connected, and you probably learn a lot. You can learn a lot about that if you take an economics class. Natural forces certainly affect us greatly. Obviously, things like the weather. If there is an increase in storms and rain and snow, obviously people are going to buy certain types of products. Increase seasonality certainly affects purchase of products. For instance, what would you buy? Bathing suits in October? Probably not. Very unlikely. You might, and as a result, they're not really on the shelves in stores at that period. We know that people tend to go swimming and go to the beach more in the spring and summer. In the late fall and winter, they'll buy maybe heavy coats or snowmobiles or things like that. So seasonality very much affects the products we buy and what we can market. Pollution, while not technically natural, although it depends upon your definition of what natural is, certainly affects there. So we get filters, and we do a lot of other things that will affect our products, or products that will affect us. Biology in general, and having recently experienced a major pandemic, we all understand how biology can affect us. Normally, when I talk about biology, most people think, well, it doesn't have much effect on us, but certainly vaccines and epidemics and parasites and pests affecting crops will certainly affect the supply and demand of certain products. Certainly, during the pandemic, the demand for certain products, went up, like masks and vaccines and so forth, which makes sense. Natural disasters, which is kind of related to weather, but storms, like hurricanes, forest fires, that sort of thing will affect the demand for products. For instance, forest fires in the Western United States have increased the demand for firefighting equipment. This includes, hand equipment, as well as, things like special helicopters that can go over the Pacific Ocean, suck up water, and then carry it and drop it on forest fires, and other types of equipment. So, hurricanes also increase the demand for plywood. If a hurricane's coming, some people will buy plywood to put it over their windows and doors, and after the hurricane leaves, maybe there are houses that are damaged, so people need plywood for that. And so I guarantee you, Home Depot stocks up on plywood when there are storms coming. In fact, actually, Walmart employs their own meteorologist to plot storms, because when there are disasters coming, the demand for certain products, skyrockets. And you might guess what some of those are. Things like bottled water, batteries, flashlights, maybe generators. One that might surprise you is Pop-Tarts. When I first heard this, I laughed. You may have. But if you think about it, yeah, okay, Pop-Tarts are in small waterproof containers. I mean, they really come in a box, but they're individually, well, wrapped in two, in units of two. They don't need to be cooked. They even finicky kids will eat them. And so there's a huge demand for Pop-Tarts. It's sort of like a survival food almost. So there are also demographic forces, and this is what's happening to the population itself. We have many generations. The only actually official generation recognized by the Census Department, excuse me, are actually the baby boomers, and the baby boomers were the children of the World War II generation. During World War II, millions and millions of people were killed in various ways. After the war was over, people, mostly men, came back home, and what did they want to do? They wanted to get on with their lives. They wanted to get married. They wanted to have kids, have households, and do a lot of other things. And out of that came a huge, massive bubble of new human beings, and called the baby boomers. I actually technically am a baby boomer myself, but I'm on the tail end, so I don't really think of myself as a baby boomer. But actually, marketers for decades have followed the baby boomers. They're this big, huge demographic group. So, excuse me. They were the hippies in the 1960s. They were the yuppies in the 1970s. Now, where are the baby boomers? Well, many of them are in retirement. What kind of products are they looking for? Well, medical services, and there's been a huge jump in the demand for medical services. I know that, for instance, many pharmaceutical companies have switched their focus from cardiovascular research to neurological research, for instance, to treat dementia and Alzheimer's, that sort of thing, because the baby boomers are getting older. Particularly those, well, everyone's getting older, but they're getting into that period. Also, there has been a huge explosion in the demand for retirement communities, and this is because of the baby boomers. And they, over the decades, that all the marketers have been following them. What do the baby boomers need? Because there's so many of them. The following generation, also called Generation X, some people call it the birth dearth, because that was a much lower, smaller group. Because the baby boomers were actually the result, and this actually occurs in nature. When there's a natural disaster, let's say there's a huge forest fire, the surviving animals, and we are animals, actually start to increase their reproduction rate after a disaster. But what happens after that? Then it drops off, because there is a sort of type of balancing out that goes on. So Generation X was a much smaller generation, and then after that they came up again, and called this Generation Y, also known as millennials. And there is, of course, now after that, Generation Z. I'm not sure what happens now that we've come to the end of the alphabet. I don't know what the next generation will be called, but we're not quite there yet. And many of these millennials, the millennials as a group, are being followed by marketers. What do millennials like? What are they going to need, want, and demand? So there's that. Some other changes. It's actually, we're kind of going back to this, where we actually have multi-generational families. This was not that unusual. I look at my father's when my father was growing up, he lived with his parents. Obviously, he was a little kid, but also they lived with their grandparents, and I would always hear about various uncles who would be living in that house at the time. And then sort of after that, we got, especially as we got into the 1950s and 60s, there was more the idea of the nuclear family. There was, mother, father, 2.3 kids. I always felt bad for the 0.3 kid, but there we go. Now we're seeing slight return to the multi-generational family. Now it might be for economic reasons in part. Certainly, that's a contributor. I'm not sure how strong that trend will go, but we'll see. We're seeing increased diversity in a way that we've never seen before. If you go before 1965, the country was fairly segregated, racially and in other ways. Obviously along racial and ethnic lines, but also in terms of gender. Men did certain jobs, women did certain jobs, and now we're seeing, for instance, you very rarely ever see a male nurse, or a female doctor. Now, it's much more mixed. So we're seeing a diversity in terms of ethnic backgrounds. In terms of gender, you go into workplaces and they are very, very, diverse, very mixed. And for some people some people have had problems with that, but we also need to reflect that in, for instance, in our advertising, showing a workplace as just all white males is now unrealistic and disconnected. And in other ways, for instance, other groups we have to show, and there's a lot more representation. We need that. We also see a trend in increased education. For instance, I look at my own family history. My grandfather was the first member of his family ever to finish high school, to get a high school diploma. My father was the first to get a college degree. I'm the first to get a master's degree. My son was asking me, does that mean I have to get a PhD? No, he doesn't have to get a PhD. So, so there's that. But it's not just simply the levels, but also how many people. Many of you are going after degrees that maybe a generation or two you wouldn't have. I mean, my uncle, who worked in a Fortune 500 company, did very well. He actually only had a high school degree, and actually he had a GED, and he did very well. But today he would not be able to do that because there is a higher demand for education. Of course, we have to understand people have to understand how to use computers, and the world is more complex. So that requires a higher level of education. We also have all sorts of social and cultural forces. You go around the world, all these different cultures, and if we're trying to market into all these different cultures, we have to be aware of them. Certainly their customs, for instance, does someone shake hands? Do they bow? That sort of thing. Greetings. How do you greet somebody? What are the attitudes about certain things? Certain types of products. Is this a acceptable product, or is this a product that your culture would not be interested in? And I have dealt with some issues like that. What are the morals and what are the taboos in that society? And we've seen change of that. For instance, let's see, if we were in the same room and I was going to hand you something and I would hand it like this to you, I know it's hard to see. This would be a problem because this would be my left hand. In certain societies, you never hand anyone something with their left hand, only with your right hand. I know this particularly in certain Arabic cultures as well as Korean cultures. You have to use the right hand. In fact, my son worked for a Korean gentleman, and I would come visit him, and he was very friendly. Oh, Mr. Bale, how are you? And what he would do is he'd extend his right hand, but take his left hand and put it behind. And if you can see, he put it behind his elbow, so there'd be no chance of him accidentally touching me with his left hand. This is actually a very ancient custom. It has to do with tribal living, communal. You eat from the communal bowl, and for that you use your right hand. You dip into the communal bowl and eat with your right hand. Your left hand was used for hygiene. You never put your left hand in the communal bowl. You never expose anyone to your left hand. You know, and there are a whole bunch of other little other taboos and customs and morals. And having done some international travel, I've come up against some of them. You know, I've made some mistakes. You know, I was offered. I think I was in Brazil, and in the rural area of Brazil, and I was offered something called a yerba mate, which is actually, it's a kind of metal cup with a metal straw in it and all these leaves. And I didn't know what I thought it was like the only thing I could think of it was a bong or something like that. And I you know, wouldn't do that. Certainly wouldn't do it on while working. But it wasn't. It was this yerba mate. It's actually they pour hot water in it. It's actually a very highly caffeinated tea. And it is shared. You actually all suck on the same. It's not particularly hygienic, but you suck on the same metal straw. And it is a thing of greeting. And all these little things that you would need to pick up. We certainly have seen changing family structures. As I was referring to, you know, there were the multi-generational families and the nuclear family. But, you know, in the last several decades, divorce has become much more acceptable. So instead of the traditional family of mother, father, you know, 2.3 kids, it's maybe single head of household, or maybe a blended family where two divorced people with their children come and live together. My neighbor, well, he wasn't divorced. His wife passed away, and he got married to a woman who I don't know what happened to her husband, but the kids now had to live together, and that was kind of an interesting thing. Also, you know, gay families where the parents are you know, same sex. You know, that was something you would never have seen, you know, a few decades ago. So we're having various you know, changes in family structures. We are seeing in at least the United States the acceptance of gay lifestyles. This is not universal, and is certainly not everywhere in the world. There are still cultures where being gay is considered socially unacceptable, which is unfortunate. So we've seen a much more concern about the environment. This has become a personal value, or a cultural value for many cultures. I remember living in a world where people would litter all the time, and you know, nobody cared about the environment because it's just something they took for granted. They didn't even think about it. Now, as we've learned more about global warming, even before understanding about global warming, there was learning about the problems with pollutants in our environment. But so now a lot of people are very concerned about that. Things like diets. There are a lot of trends in diets. I remember in the 90s, all of a sudden everyone was going low carb, put several bakeries out of business. People started worrying about trans fats. People now also more people are trying to cut back on eating meat, cutting back on consuming sugar. We're learning more. A lot of this is driven by, you know, new knowledge, but it does shift things. So this is one of my favorites. Japanese wrapping paper, which is beautiful. I mean, if I were, you know, if you and I had a relationship where I would give you a birthday present, I would, you know, go up into my attic and I'd go through the box and I would find whatever wrapping paper wasn't holiday wrap and wrap a gift for you. And I give it to you, receive it, you'd open it up, and you know, hopefully you like it and thank me. In Japan, that would not be the way to do things. First off, much care is put into the wrapping of presents. And I've seen some wonderful examples of Japanese wrapping paper it's not simply the paper, but how it's folded. It's actually very ornate, and that is just as important as the gift inside. In fact, when you in the Japanese culture, when a gift is presented, the gift is the wrapping is admired, and it is not opened in the presence of the giver. And that's sort of an interesting, different cultural thing. This is also from the same culture that gave us origami, so that's kind of a nice, nice thing. China has something called six pocket syndrome. This was described to me, and this is actually there is, well, I have to go back a little bit in history, explain how this all came about. If you are familiar at all with the Chinese Revolution, Chairman Mao, who basically took over China and imposed communism on China, and Mao set a goal for China that by the year 2000, 1 out of every 2 people on planet Earth would be Chinese. He wanted the Chinese culture to dominate planet Earth. So he basically told everyone, have lots of kids, because that's a way you can dominate a society, if you have lots of kids as part of your cultural group. His successors realized that this was not a particularly good or sustainable thing, because if you have more people, you have to feed them, you have to clothe them, and actually the feeding and clothing of people in China was not very good. In fact, you can take if you looked at pictures from people from the 1960s, 70s, that era, they all wore Mao suits. They were these gray or blue suits. They were very unflattering. They were like a uniform, even though technically they weren't. And people either walked, had carts, or drove bicycles. There weren't a lot of cars, and it was economically in a very bad shape. Mao's successors realized this, and they then imposed something called the one-child policy, which you might be familiar with. And to do that, that changed, and it took a couple of generations. They wanted to bring the population down, essentially. And if you, for instance, look at a family tree, your family tree or my family tree, there are people, and then you see as you go down, there are like usually more children. For instance, I'm one of 3 children. And you see more. And I had aunts and uncles and so forth. But in China, because it's only one child, you only see, you don't have any aunts or uncles. You don't have brothers or sisters. And this actually creates an unusual, it's kind of where I think of a family tree is looking like this. A Chinese family tree looks like this. So there's one child at the bottom, there's 2 parents, and there's 4 sets of 4 grandparents. And this means this is the only child they're going to have. I can tell you from personal experience, when my wife and I had our first child, and I remember our first Christmas, we went to my parents' house for Christmas, and we walked in and we were overwhelmed. My parents had gone nuts. It was their first grandchild. On my wife's side, they had already had grandchildren, so they didn't go quite as nuts. But they went, my parents went absolutely nuts. They bought tons. I felt like we walked into a toy store. And that seems like a strange thing to complain about, but we couldn't actually get all the toys in the car. They just went nuts, and we had to have, it became a little tense. We had to have a little discussion with them, and so like, we can't spoil these kids, this kid too much. Well, imagine if that was just their first grandchild. Imagine if that was going to be their only grandchild. And there's a competition. There's, there are 2 parents, there's 2 sets of grandparents. There's a little competition that happens. And it's, this is where we get the 6 pocket syndrome. There was a market in China for very expensive gifts because there's a certain competition, and for the love and attention of their only grandchild, the only grandchild they will ever have. Now, the the one-child policy has been somewhat moderated a bit, so it's not quite as severe, but it does create some interesting problems, these sort of things. My final example is Euro Disney. I'm sure many of you, well, probably not all, have gone to Walt Disney World in Florida. It's a very fun vacation if you get to go. The people at Disney noticed that they had a lot of European visitors. They were kind of surprised how many people had not simply come, but they also had to pay for the transatlantic flight to get to Florida. And the people at Disney said, well, wait a minute, we have a lot of people who were coming from Europe to come to our theme park. Imagine how many would love to come if they would come if they did, who are not coming now. And the thing that's holding them back is the transatlantic fare and the expense of coming across the Atlantic Ocean. So they said, what if we open up a Walt Disney World in Europe? And they did. And you may have heard about Euro Disney, and sometimes it's referred to in negative terms, because what they did is essentially copied all their theme park in Orlando, and they found a location about an hour outside of Paris and set it up there. And it was a disaster because it was very much, it was in conflict with the European culture, particularly the French culture. For instance, people would come with picnic baskets, which is the custom. You go on a day trip, you bring a picnic basket. And Disney said, oh, no, you can't bring food, and you have to pay for our, ridiculously expensive Disney food. That did not go over well. Also, when they came in, they could not consume alcohol. In France, wine is very big. Even children drink wine. I mean, it's watered down. I think it's called table wine. They'll drink that. The Disney culture was not an alcoholic culture. So Disney really suffered from that, and there were a few other things. So Disney kind of regrouped. They created picnic areas for people to bring in their own food in. They served wine and I think beer too. In fact, the Walt Disney World in Florida started in discrete areas offering alcoholic beverages, in limit, and definitely in Euro Epcot they allow that. So these are things that these are just a few examples, and there's a lot more examples of where there are cultural adjustments that have to be made. So another area that we have to look at is the legal and regulatory forces that have to be dealt with. Various governments pass various legislation. This is by the legislative branch, obviously. But then often the executive branch has to create regulations to sort of fine-tune those legislative laws. And also you have liability laws that come out of court rulings, like who's liable for this if this happens, that sort of thing. And also you have taxes and tariffs, sales taxes and tariffs on imported goods that also affect, how they can be marketed. We also have political events, and political events can be anything from where you're going to have a political convention, which of course, if there's a political convention in your town, that brings people to your town and that helps the economy. That's great. But it could also be things like 9/11 or war, like currently having the Ukrainian war right now during the recording of this lecture. So, and to give you some examples, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but as far as the US government, the federal government, there are all sorts of regulatory agencies. There's the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, where we get a lot of our truth in advertising laws and regulations come out of there. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So if you're in the food industry, or particularly if you're in the drug industry, you have to pay very close attention to the FDA. The FDA, if you're in the pharmaceutical business, FDA, I used to be in the pharmaceutical business. We sometimes refer to them as God, because they control whether you lived or died, whether your drug lived, whether it could be approved or not. Could you do more research on it, or do you have to stop? And so you have to be very careful. And they actually also influence advertising. And for instance, if you see a drug ad that says, "Oh, may cause all these side effects," that's because the FDA says you have to reveal the side effects. If you're in the financial industry, the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, regulates a lot of your, well, they regulate the accounting, public accounting laws. They regulate all sorts of things regarding to, stocks and other securities. The U.S. Postal Service also. I mean, these are just a few examples. Most people don't realize the post office actually has a police department, because if you, for instance, create a fraudulent brochure and put it through the mail to a customer or anyone, that is considered a felony. So you be careful not to do that. Taxes and tariffs. Again, for instance, we have very high taxes on cigarettes, which is ironic because at the same time the U.S. government also subsidizes tobacco farmers. So it's kind of a strange thing. We're a little bit in conflict. September 11th, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon had a huge effect, not only on us politically and socially, but also economically, and certain industries in particular. For instance, obviously it hurt the airline industry, but it did help the security industry, the people who make scanners, the people who train security guards and police forces and all sorts of equipment. So an event, regardless of what type of force it is, may generally be considered negative, but for certain industries may be positive. So some industries were hurt very much by 9/11, and many were helped by 9/11. So we also have copyrights, trademarks, and patents. This is an area I'm particularly interested in, since copyright is a protection of any creative work, whether it's a painting, a photograph, a book, a poem, a sculpture, a piece of software, anything that is considered is created by the human mind or executed in some way, like take a photograph, and that can be copyrighted. And it is essentially it exists just by the creation of it, but to protect it, you'd often have to register your copyright with the Library of Congress. Trademarks pertain to trade names. So once you've registered the trademark, then they're the only ones who can use it, at least within that category. So for instance, if my name were McDonald and I decided I wanted to open up a restaurant and I want to name it after myself, I call it McDonald's Restaurant. I can't do that because the McDonald's Hamburger Corporation has trademarked that name, as well as the logo and so forth. But if my name is McDonald and I want to open up a hardware store, or I want to do start a software company, that's no problem. I can, because I'm not in conflict with the McDonald's Hamburger Corporation. I'm in a different product category. And it's like, for instance, you look at the name Delta, there's Delta Airlines, there's Delta Dental, there's other companies named Delta. As long as they're not interfering with one another, that's fine. Patents are protection for inventions. And we tend to think of them as mechanical inventions, but they don't have to be. So you invent something clever, you are given essentially a monopoly on it. Actually, all of these are kind of government granted monopolies. 17 to 21 years. So for instance, and where there's an area that, because I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, I'm aware of. So if you discover a drug, you can patent it. And then the clock starts. So you have 21 years that you are the only person who can sell it, or you can license it, you can do whatever you want with it, but you have control of it. 21 years and a day later, anyone can take that patent, and it can take your invention and sell it and use it. In fact, you actually have to submit the details of your invention to the patent office. So, and that becomes a public document. So your competitors can look at your patent, but they can't do anything with it. They can't market your patent until 21 years have passed. But they might figure ways to get around patents. So I actually had a client that had come up with an invention, and we recommended holding off filing the patent, keeping it trade secret. There were only a few people who really understood. I mean, I was aware of it, but I could never explain it to anyone. So I said, there's so few people who can even understand what your invention is, much less copy it. So I keep a trade secret, and once you're ready to really make it public, then you patent it. Hold the clock off. What was my recommendation. So there are local examples, blue laws. These usually pertain to not selling alcohol or other things on the Sabbath, usually Sunday. For instance, in the state of New Jersey, you're not allowed to sell automobiles on Sunday. So all the automobile dealerships are closed on Sunday. And I actually spoke to somebody about that, and who worked at a dealership, and said, thank God they have that. Otherwise, I'd be working Sundays too. Bergen County is very big on blue laws. This one is kind of an odd one. The municipal ordinances of automotive window tinting. There's some town in New York State that has a law against driving a car with window tinting, and this is a really wacky one, because automotive companies can't create cars just for certain municipalities. The person who got the ticket was somebody who lived in Florida, where everyone has tinted windows. So kind of an odd one. It's not a good idea. Bad law. International examples, you might have price controls by other countries. Generally in the United States, we can charge whatever price we choose for our products. In some countries, there are some limits. Norway comes to mind. They are very price controlly. I don't know if this law is still in effect, but you cannot sell products at a discount, except for 2 weeks a year. Now, I'm not sure if this law is still in effect. They may have repealed this law, but it was a law at one point. This is one I came up against personally. France and Germany, you're not allowed to advertise pharmaceuticals to consumers. We do that in the United States all the time, but I came up against this because I was in charge of launching a website for a pharmaceutical product, and the night before we were going to launch it, I got a call from the director of European operations saying, I think he called from his home. He was in Europe, and he called me and he said, you cannot post the information about the German or French versions of the product, because we have these laws. And I said, well, yeah, but I'm in the United States. The servers in the United States says, no, they will come after us. Do not launch. And he was quite serious. And I had to very quickly kind of pull out all the German and French information and all the links to the site. I couldn't even imply that there was that product existed. There are some governments country governments which will restrict foreign investment. For instance, in Japan, you are not allowed to own more than 50% of a Japanese company. So things like that. This doesn't happen very often anymore, but it used to happen a lot, particularly when there's a lot of revolutions, where a new government would take over by force and then nationalize the industry. What I mean by nationalizing it, they would take it. So if you had a factory in country X, and a dictator or somebody else took over that country, they could say, this industry belongs to the government. Essentially, they would just take it without any compensation. That doesn't happen so much anymore, but it could. So, technological forces, while individual companies do create technologies, we don't really control the whole technological environment. We certainly have seen a lot of examples with the creation of computers. I know most people do not remember the world before computers, before they were generally available. I do. That speaks a lot to my age. But that has changed, and computers are constantly changing. Most people are not using desktop computers anymore. And I remember when that was the new thing, that was the most exciting advancement, that you could actually have a computer on your desk as opposed to a big mainframe that had to be in a special room. Um, the creation of the, or the, not so just the creation of the internet, but the basically making it so easily available to everyone. And that has changed a lot in the way a lot of us work. Obviously, during the pandemic, we were able to, communicate and meet remotely. Um, Certainly, cell phones have changed. Now there's smartphones and video conferencing, which in the last few years have gotten a big boost because of the pandemic. Um, and there's this technological convergence. A lot of technologies are being put into, this device that we hold in our pockets, and that's a big deal. So, advances in genetics, you know, uh, that certainly has advanced medicine, but also, analyzing all sorts of things. Like they're talking about having um, locks that only react to certain people's genetics. Um, and certainly, one thing in genetics is that generally when people make drugs, or companies make drugs, they make it for everybody. Well, now they're thinking about, well, maybe, and the drug never works on everybody. It only works on a large number of people, but not everybody. And so they're looking, maybe we can make certain drugs that'll work with people with certain genetic profiles that'll work better, with those people. And there's a lot of work going on in that area. I'm going to finish up with talking a little bit about something called a SWOT analysis. We need to take a look at a lot of things within our companies, within our product lines, and how they relate to the environment. And we can do a SWOT analysis, and SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And strengths and weaknesses tend to be internal to the company, to the product, where opportunities and threats tend to be external. So for instance, if you have a good product, well, that's a hell of a strength. Excellent. If you have a great product, more power to you. If your product has an advantage over a competitor, that's fantastic. If you have a wide variety of products, if you have a broad product line, that is an excellent advantage, an excellent strength. You have many flavors, many colors, many functions, that sort of thing. If you have real expertise in the field, in the product category, that's very helpful. If you have strong relationships with your customers, great. They like you, you like them, they come back, great. If you have an enhanced or a really high production capacity, that means you can produce a lot. It means you can produce them cheaper. The economies of scale are available to you. And or if you have a unique distribution system. People love talking about their strengths. If I've done SWOT analysis in groups, and everyone loves talking about their strengths, but you also need to talk about your weaknesses. And this is not something everyone loves quite so much. And actually, I could just take everything I just listed and turn it on its head. Weak products, lack of expertise, poor customer relations, limited production capacity, poor distribution system, on and on. So take the strengths, turn them on their head, and the weaknesses. The interesting thing is that a strength in one area can actually create a weakness in another. And I'll give you an example from my own experience. I worked for a company that we had a really great product. It was head and shoulders better than our competition. Our competition didn't even come close. And it actually became a very easy product to sell. All our customers, or the markets, understood the value of our product. They wanted it. And of course we raised the price, and because of the high demand, which is fine. But unfortunately, some of our sales reps became a little bit arrogant, or a little maybe taking the customer for granted. and our relationships were not as strong. And I would hear about sales reps who say, "Hey, you better buy it before the price goes up," which is not a really friendly, endearing way to develop a relationship. But they had such a great product they could get away with it. Well, there's always that day that comes when a competitor comes who's just as good, and we claimed we were still better, but their product in reality was probably just as good as ours. And our sales directors and managers had to say to our sales reps, "Hey, you better build those relationships because we now have serious competition. We don't have the advantage we once had." And it took a while to build up, and then there was this patina of arrogance on our sales force, and they had to clean that off and be much friendlier and much more. They had to listen more carefully. They had to be better at building those relationships. So opportunities, there are always opportunities. You introduce a new product, that's an opportunity. And it's not only an opportunity to sell the new product, but also reconnect with people to sell more of the old product. There's an advantage there. If there are new markets you can enter, that's an opportunity. If you can maybe go into another country or some other market that is not being served, that's an opportunity. If you can detect, and this is hard to find, if there are needs that are not being fulfilled, so, you find a customer base or consumers who are not, they have a need and it's not being met. That's a great opportunity if provided you can fulfill that need. Any positive changes in the environment, and again, it has to be positive for you, for your product. So 9/11 was a positive change in the environment for the security industry. So if you have a competitor who fails, and I don't mean that they go out of business, they just have to slip up a bit. And a good example of this would be the delivery service UPS. They have the brown trucks and the brown shorts and that sort of thing. And they had a labor strike a number of years ago, and that really crippled their ability to deliver packages. So as a result, who do you think benefited? Well, of course, FedEx. And FedEx stood up, stepped up. They delivered, and 90% of the UPS customers moved over to FedEx. 30 days later, they resolved the strike, and 90% of the 90% that went to FedEx came back to UPS. But FedEx still kept the 10% of the new customers they had. So, so if your competitor trips up a bit, that's an opportunity. And there are companies that will buy out their competitors to reduce the competition. Now, you have to be careful. If it's large enough, you get into antitrust issues. That's a legal issue, not a marketing issue. And of course, there are threats. What kind of threats do we face? Well, a negative change in the environment, like 9/11 was a really bad change in the environment for local businesses as well as airlines and so forth. It could be all sorts of things. The bad economy. Certainly, the pandemic was a very negative change of environment for barbers and hairdressers and restaurants and very personal service type businesses. There you go. If you have a competitor who has a strong advantage over your product, that's a real threat. So you better figure out how to improve your product to eliminate that competitive advantage that they have. There's also market saturation. If sometimes there's so much product out there, you really can't grow very much, and that's a problem. So, for instance, I was telling someone about one product that's really saturated is shaving cream. You really can't grow the demand for shaving cream for instance, particularly as men start growing more and more beards. You just can't sell more shaving cream. You can still sell some, but in between electric razors and people stopping shaving, the demand is never going to grow in any significant way. If a competitor introduces a new product, that's a threat. There's that. So, we've talked about the the microenvironment, that which we have a little control over or a little influence over, the macro environment, which we have no control over. And then to look at that, SWOT analysis is a very good tool to use. And obviously, you can't ask me questions here, but in class, or if you want to email me, you can ask me questions about this material. All right, take care.